In the previous chapter, I shared some tips for a great practice, which is what worship team members should be doing on their own time in order to prepare for rehearsal. I hope you found those tips to be helpful. In today's weekly worship thought, I want to pick up where we left off and talk about how to make the most of your time together when you bring what you have practiced on your own to the group in rehearsal. As with so many leadership realities, the effectiveness of a worship team rehearsal begins and ends with the worship leader. Yes, it is up to the individual team members to be practicing on their own and preparing themselves leading up to the rehearsal. However, the vision for that practice time, the essential information and materials required to make that practice time effective, and the clearly communicated expectations for both practice and rehearsal all come from the worship leader. Leadership is not for the faint-hearted. And the first step to a great rehearsal is clear and timely communication from the worship leader. Now there's myriad ways to do this, but the point is not so much about how the information is communicated, but more about what information is communicated and when. Worship team members are going to need to know what songs they will be playing through a set list, and the arrangement, chord progression, key, and tempo for each song, which would be individual song sheets. They also need to know what day and time they're expected to be at rehearsal and about any other expectations that the worship leader may have. Now additionally, it can be helpful for the worship leader to provide reference tracks if there's a specific version of the song that they're trying to emulate. This can be as simple as a Spotify or YouTube link to that version of the song, or possibly even an iPhone recording of the worship leader simply playing a lead rhythm instrument and singing the correct arrangement at the correct tempo. Communicating a monthly or quarterly overview is quite helpful, and I would strongly encourage worship leaders to communicate with their team at the beginning of each week as well. As the worship leader, set clear time expectations for the rehearsal. I like to communicate to the team when I expect them to be set up and ready to begin with something like, hey, please be set up and ready to make music by 7 p.m. Now, I'll also let them know when we'll be finished with the rehearsal. A 90-minute rehearsal is perfect in my book, so I'll let the team know that they can expect to be finished no later than 8:30 p.m. One practical way to love one another is to respect each other's time. Worship team member, be on time and be ready to play when expected. Worship leader, do not let the rehearsal go longer than communicated. As the worship leader, communicate a clear rehearsal schedule. Let the worship team know how you intend to spend the rehearsal time together. If there's going to be a break at some point, let them know in advance. Worship team members will be far more productive when they have a clear understanding of what is happening and when. Ideally, I like to separate the musicians and the vocalists for the first 45 minutes of rehearsal. I want the vocalists to work through the lyrics and the harmony parts in a separate room somewhere else in the church. Meanwhile, the musicians will be on the stage working through the music and the musical arrangements. And then we spend 15 minutes all together working through a short devotional or perhaps a weekly worship thought, and then close that time in prayer. The final 30 minutes of our already clearly communicated 90 total minutes then are going to be spent going through the set list just as it will be performed during the service. Now, of course, there is no one right way to do this. This is just my preference. However you decide to do it, clearly communicate how you intend to spend your precious time together. Check your bad attitude at the door. I know, church is supposed to be a place where you can just be real with one another, right? Well, it is, but the rehearsal is not really the time or the place for a bad attitude. Now, like it or not, you have a task to accomplish as a worship team. A bad attitude is not only deflating to the people around you, but it's also highly contagious. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. Now, thankfully, a good attitude is also contagious. So be the person you want to hang out with. Start with a song that you all know really well. You want to start the rehearsal on the right foot. Don't spend the first 30 minutes hammering through a song that you barely know. Start each rehearsal with a song that you all know very well. There should always be at least one of those on the set list. So start the rehearsal time with some positive momentum. By starting with a familiar song, you can focus more on your monitor settings. So just stop after that first song and take the time to resolve any monitor issues, then begin to work through the rest of the songs, which will likely require more of your attention. Use a metronome. If your worship team uses in-ear monitors, then you should be running a metronome during the rehearsal and the service. However, even if you use floor wedges, you should definitely still use a metronome during rehearsal. There's simply no better tool for helping musicians learn how to play well together. Schedule an extra sound man. Having only one sound man, or a sound man who didn't even show up, has sidetracked many should have been productive rehearsals. One super practical fix is to schedule an additional extra sound man. I prefer to have one sound man and one person with the title of stagehand at each rehearsal. With this model, the sound man can stay in the sound booth while the stagehand runs back and forth from the sound booth to the stage to physically fix any issues that may arise. And we all know what kinds of issues can and will arise. With the sound man firmly established in the sound booth, the rehearsal can move forward even while the stagehand is troubleshooting a problem with the keyboard not being plugged into the correct channel or something like that. Encourage one another. Far too many of our comments during a typical rehearsal are focused on what went wrong. We want to fix these trouble spots, of course, but don't forget to highlight what went right also. Encourage one another. Give a high five. Allow yourselves to actually enjoy being together. Each member of the worship team brings their own unique personality and skillful musicianship to the group. Together, you are worshiping the Lord through music, which He created, by the way. It's a pretty awesome gig. End with an optional jam session. Even though rehearsal has a definite ending time, that doesn't mean you have to be completely finished. Collectively, the typical church worship team has a lot of creative energy. While this reality may not be overly conducive to an effective rehearsal, it can be positively channeled elsewhere. Once the rehearsal is over at the predetermined and clearly communicated time, thank everyone for their investment of time and energy. But since everyone is there already and all the equipment is set up, you may as well have fun. Strike up a jam session. Invite anyone who is willing and able to stay and to play through a few songs just for fun. This can be a great opportunity to build camaraderie and chemistry as a worship team and to just let those creative juices flow. Plus, this approach gives you ample opportunity during the rehearsal time to unleash epic one-line zingers like, "Hey Jimi Hendrix, why don't you save that solo for the jam session?" Now, I've already offered my best tips for a great rehearsal, which I hope were super helpful, but sometimes it can be helpful to offer some anti-tips, or perhaps some tips for an unproductive rehearsal. So with that in mind, here are a few to consider. If you want to have an unproductive rehearsal, come unprepared. Have absolutely no idea what you are doing and just play what feels right. With everyone just feeling it, things are bound to go super well, right? If you want to have an unproductive rehearsal, ask everyone for their opinion instead of giving clear direction. Nothing says we're all unified quite like 7 people having 8 different opinions. When you open the direction up and ask for everyone's input, several members will feel put on the spot, others will inevitably be upset that their opinion was not the one that the group went with. And so many potential ideas will be thrown out that it will leave the final decision unclear. If you want to have an unproductive rehearsal time, just schedule one sound man. This is an especially effective strategy on those days when everything seems to be going wrong. And the sound man has to run back and forth from the sound booth to the stage to check, double check, hook up and rehook up cable after cable while the worship team members alternate between watching him work and watching the second hand of the clock tick away minute after precious minute until you're finally ready to make music and you only have 45 minutes of rehearsal time left. Sure, it would have been easier, more productive, and less stressful to schedule a second sound man, but then how would your main sound man get in all of his daily steps? If you want to have an unproductive rehearsal, do not bring a pen or a pencil. Even when everyone has taken the time to come prepared, some changes will inevitably need to be made. When those changes are made, the new directions either need to be promptly written down or left to several different versions of people trying to remember what was decided. Someone once said that the shortest pencil is longer than the longest memory. But hey, if you want to wreck the rehearsal, don't write anything down. If you want to have an unproductive rehearsal, feel free to play your instrument at your leisure, especially when the worship leader is giving directions. I don't know what it is about having an instrument at your fingertips, but for some reason we tend to think that it means we have to play it whenever we feel like it. Having everyone play their instrument whenever they feel like it is really no different than having everyone talk at once. It is a great way to ensure that everyone hears nothing. And while we're at it, if you want to have an unproductive rehearsal, feel free to talk about absolutely anything at any moment. Sure, we have a job to do and a task to accomplish in a limited amount of time, by the way, but by all means, let's take the next 15 minutes to talk about how your day at work went and to recount the big plays from the big game last weekend. Alternatively, we could spend our precious rehearsal time working together to solidify the parts of the actual songs we are going to be leading the congregation in singing to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And we could save those conversations for before or after rehearsal, but hey, if you want to have an unproductive rehearsal time, go ahead and have those conversations between each song. So much more could be said, but I'm guessing we all have seen a little bit, or maybe a lot of it, of ourselves and our worship team in at least one of those slightly comical examples I listed. No one is expecting you to be perfect, but hopefully we are each striving to become better, more thoughtful worship team members while extending grace for one another along the way. What was one interesting truth or idea that stood out to you today, and how do you think that truth or idea will help you in the future? Do you agree that the effectiveness of a worship team rehearsal begins and ends with the worship leader? Why or why not? After considering these tips for a great rehearsal, how important do you think it is for worship team members to be practicing on their own prior to rehearsal? Why do you feel this way? On a scale of 1 being not great to 10 being awesome, how productive do you think your current rehearsal methods have been? What practical elements have made your rehearsal times the most or least productive? In what ways do you think the worship team and congregation would be affected if you use these tips for a great rehearsal on a regular basis?